You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
The family that vacations together stays together. At least, that was the plan. Except now, the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for this day.
Wish you could become a morning person? You know the type, up before the sun, early morning runs, first one to the office with donuts and a smile. How do they do it? Easy. With the new Galaxy Watch 8, sleep tracking and personalized insights from Samsung Health help you improve so you can wake up to a whole new you. One who, dare I say it, skips the snooze? It's possible. Train your sleep with Galaxy Watch 8. Learn more at Samsung.com. Requires compatible Samsung Galaxy phone, Samsung Health app, and Samsung account.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, Summary Episode 7, The Spanish Civil War. As with all of our summary episodes, this episode covers an earlier series of the podcast, in this case, the Spanish Civil War, which was released back in 2020. This is in anticipation for the North Africa 1940 episodes that will start next week, sort of as a revisit of things that happened in the Mediterranean, specifically as they related to Spain and Italy, that would impact the war in North Africa when it would begin in June 1940. There are many political threads that collided during the Second World War. The rampant anti-communism in Western Europe, the rise of fascism in Italy and then Germany, the military and totalitarian coups in Eastern Europe, and many others. I could keep listing them for a while. But before the war that would spiral out to consume so much of the globe, the major political ideologies would come into direct conflict in Spain. The Spanish Civil War would last from 1936 to 1939, and it would have many causes. Spain was neutral during the First World War, but the impact of that war was still strongly felt, with the economic issues and then the Spanish flu causing issues for a society that was already feeling strain. After the war, political stability would be found in the form of the military dictatorship under Primo de Rivera, who would take up the power in September 1923. Rivera did attempt to fix some of the issues he thought were weighing down Spain, but he would be unable to do so before he would resign in January 1931. While Rivera had been far from perfect, he had at least provided stability, which would be lacking during the rest of the decade. 2 prime ministers would attempt to carry on Rivera's government before the elections in April 1931, which resulted in a strong victory for the Socialists and the Republicans. Once they were victorious, the Second Spanish Republic would be declared on April 14, 1931. The new Republican government, unfortunately, would have all of the problems that the Rivera government had also had, including the impact of the Great Depression with all of its typical economic upheavals. There were also many other unresolved issues that continued to be a problem. Basque and Catalan nationalism was difficult to resolve. The position of the Catholic Church within Spanish society and its support for groups that disagreed with the new republic was also an issue. And all of these issues would come to a head in 1933 and then 1934, when the unity of the left political parties, which had helped to create the new republic, would begin to dissolve at precisely the wrong time, because the Nationalists, the right-wing political groups within Spain, were beginning to put aside their differences and coalesce around the goal of throwing down the new republic. The core issue for the Republican government, which would lead directly into the Civil War, was precisely the same set of problems that governments from all over the world would have to face when they come into the government on a wave of public dissatisfaction. There was a growing feeling that the government was not reforming society fast enough. This would result in a nationwide strike in October 1934, with workers all over Spain supporting the action. But it was not fully supported, with some groups like the CNT, the anarchist party in Catalonia, abstaining from the action due to ideological differences with the socialists that had first called for the strike. But also, the entire strike was just not well organized, and it allowed specific groups to be suppressed by the government and the military, with the striking workers in the region of Asturias being particularly brutally oppressed by a general named Francisco Franco. he would later be somewhat important. The general strike had two important consequences. It greatly widened the rifts that had already developed on the Spanish left, building more distrust among certain groups, but more importantly, it also further united the Spanish right due to the greatest of all fears for those groups, a leftist revolution. The final form of the Republican government would be the Popular Front, which would come into power in January 1936. It was a coalition of leftist parties that would be able to carry the Republicans to victory in the elections of February. This victory was only possible due to the support of the anarchist groups, which typically abstained from elections entirely for ideological reasons. But in some ways, this victory was a poisoned chalice. With the leftist parties again claiming victory, workers kind of saw it as an opportunity to agitate further, to make more demands, under the belief that now that the Popular Front was in power, it was time to make the changes they believed were necessary to address Spain's challenges. The issue was that as this worker agitation continued to increase, the Popular Front would be met with a united Spanish right that was built around strong anti-socialist, anti-communist, and anti-anarchist views among several influential groups that were all working together, and they really didn't like that the workers were getting all uppity. The first of these groups would be the Catholic Church, which had a lot of influence in Spain, even though less than about a quarter of Spaniards actually routinely attended Mass. The second group would be the Falange Española, or the Spanish Phalanx, which was a group that was formed in October 1933. The best comparison for the Falange were the fascist groups that had been formed in Italy before Mussolini came to power. And in fact, the Falange had strong support from Italy, which was primarily financial in nature. The Falange were strong supporters of the church and saw it as a critical part of the Spanish identity, with the collapse of the support for the church being one of the primary causes of the continued issues in Spanish society, at least according to this group. The final group, which would show strong support for the nationalist cause, was the military. Many of its commanders were strong supporters of nationalism in general, and maybe some fascism thrown in there as well, including General Francisco Franco, who would eventually lead the nationalist forces during the Civil War. The military was not unified, though, and there were soldiers and officers on both sides of the political disagreements, and in fact, it would be soldiers on both sides and the murder of some of their leaders, which would be the excuse used by Franco and his supporters to actually kick off the Civil War. The start of the Spanish Civil War sort of started with a military coup that would take place on July 17, 1936, and it would begin not in Spain, but in Africa. General Franco was at this time the commander of the Army of Africa, and he commanded an army that was made up of not just conscripts, but instead long-service regular troops that had been with him for years. The loyalty was there, and this gave him a tremendous advantage. There were also many Moroccan troops that had a lot of experience in fighting, which would be so crucial due to the overall lack of experience in many Civil War armies over the next 3 years. During the early morning of July 17th, Franco and his army went into open revolt against Spanish leadership in Madrid. Then the next day in Spain, many military units would do the same, with some of these units not even really knowing the plan, but joining up anyway, because the Army of Africa was revolting. That seems like a good idea, I guess. The government in Madrid would try to downplay the issue, but already the news was out, and chaos would spread throughout Spain like wildfire. In this chaos, the military units that had joined the coup had the advantage, as they were quickly sent to execute orders prepared by the Spanish generals that had joined with Franco. These were generals like General Mola, who had played a major role in planning the coup in the first place, and was ready to kind of set it into motion. At the same time that all of this was happening, the main anarchist and socialist unions would declare that due to the military coup, the workers were going on strike. This strike was not the typical kind of strike. The stoppage of work was only a secondary concern, because the unions knew that the best way to get the workers of Spain organized in the streets and ready to resist the military was to call a general strike, which activated all kinds of pre-existing plans to begin erecting barricades in the cities and to pull from arms caches to arm the workers to get ready to fight. In some cases, the workers were also joined by peasants from the surrounding countryside, like in the city of Seville. The union leaders then made an appeal to the government, give them weapons so that they could better resist the military coup that was obviously spreading. But the government was concerned about giving even more weapons to the workers, which was just a complete lack of understanding of where the threat was coming from. If you look throughout this period of history, there's so many situations in which a Republican or democratically elected government decides not to go all in with the workers and with the left against a military or right-wing coup, and that is really just the worst possible option, and that's exactly what would happen here. Also, within the Republican government itself, there was chaos, with leadership struggles and just a lack of ability to quickly unite around a singular purpose and objective. This was unfortunate for the future of the Republic because this was probably the only moment that they had a real chance to win the Civil War, and that moment was about to be over. And really, it only existed in the first place because there were two major challenges the Nationalists faced that they would have to work through. The first was the fact that they were able to capture almost none of Spain's larger cities during the initial confusion. This was somewhat expected, though, because the cities were the epicenter of the workers' unions, which had already proven to be one of the few groups within Spain that could act as quickly and decisively as the military. The second problem was that the Spanish Navy had not joined the coup. This meant that most of the important military forces for the coup, Franco's troops in Africa being prime among them, were, well, in Africa. This would be solved by the use of German and Italian aircraft, but those would not arrive until August, and until they were in Spain, it was up to the military forces in Spain itself to hold the line. Once the airborne ferry operations started, real order could be brought to the nationalist efforts, although it would take several months. On the nationalist side, there were also disagreements about who should be leading the effort, but eventually Franco would be able to minimize the influence of the other military leaders and take the title of caudillo on the 1st of October. He would then have control of the Spanish military for the rest of his life, and he would lead the nationalist effort during all of that time. More than matching these leadership squabbles on the nationalist side were the many issues of coordination that would plague the Republican cause throughout the entire war. On the Republican side, there were three groups with very different views on how to fight the war and what the future of Spain should be. These groups were the Republicans, who were fighting for a future democratic Spanish Republic, much like what was already in place before the Civil War. The next group was the Communists, who believed that the best path forward was changing Spain into a new communist state on the model of the Soviet Union. The final group was the collection of anarchist groups, which were most prevalent in the region of Catalonia. During the early months of the Civil War, when the situation seemed most dire, these groups generally worked together towards the same goal: military bad, must stop military. But as the Civil War progressed, and as the overall situation within the war began to deteriorate, their disagreements would begin to mount, and it would cause disaster. Hey guys, millions of men have problems with ED every year. Maybe that's you. Maybe you don't want to talk about it because nobody wants to talk about it, but it happens, and RexMD is here to help. RexMD is a licensed provider of ED medication, and it starts with just a short, simple quiz to help determine the best path forward for you. Everybody is different. There are no one-size-fits-all treatments, but RexMD has all of the options. Oh, and after some private consultations, your personal treatment arrives directly to your door in discreet packaging. You are not alone. RexMD has been chosen by 475,000 men. So if you need to be ready when the mood strikes, head on over to rexmd.com/SWW to get up to 95% off your ED treatment. See full details and usage at rexmd.com. Prescription required. Results may vary. Visit rexmd.com/SWW and get up to 95% off your ED treatment. Thank you, RexMD, for sponsoring this episode.
No one should have to choose between their own safety and their pets. But nearly half of domestic abuse survivors delay leaving because they can't bring their pets with them. Purina is helping to create more pet-friendly domestic violence shelters through the Purple Leash Project, so survivors and their pets can escape and heal together. Visit Purina.com/purple to learn more.
One of the most important early battles of the war would occur around the Spanish capital of Madrid. At least initially, Madrid seemed safe from the most important military unit on the nationalist side, the Army of Africa, but they would make a very fast march north after they captured Seville. Taking the city of Madrid was important because, well, it was the capital, and there would be a lot of prestige and sort of legitimacy placed on who held the capital. The defenders of Madrid were a mix of every type of group that fought against the Nationalists during the Civil War, and it was a great example of the power of a civil resistance when the civilian population of a city was just pouring out into the streets to take part in the defense. They built barricades, they created fortifications, and then they took part in the fighting. In the initial stages, the anarchists and communist militias, who from an ideological perspective could not be more different, fought side by side in the frantic days of defense. And they were all successful. And the Battle of Madrid, which the Nationalists hoped to capture quickly, turned into the Siege of Madrid, which would drag on for years to come. With the move on Madrid not having the quick results that the Nationalist leaders had hoped for, a new strategy was required, and it would be one that would take time. And during this time, Spain would be split between the two warring sides, with the Nationalists controlling territory in the south and west of Spain, while the Republican groups were the strongest in the east, north, and the far northwest corner in the Basque regions of northern Spain. The Basques had a long history of autonomy within Spain, and when confronted with the nationalist threat, they quickly formed their own military units and began to work on defenses to protect their region from nationalist advances. They were quickly cut off from communication with the other major Republican areas of Spain by nationalist advances north through the center of Spain to the French border, and then the nationalists would begin the process of breaking down the Basque resistance. As the nationalist forces slowly took over more and more territory, on April 25, 1937, the infamous bombing of Guernica would occur. The bombing would become worldwide news because it would involve German Ju-52 bombers that would bomb the city for hours. Hundreds of civilians would be killed, many times that would be wounded, and large areas of the town itself would be destroyed. It was one of the earliest examples of a major bombing raid on a purely civilian target, pure terror bombing, and it made news around the world. Such raids would become almost commonplace during the Second World War, but in 1937, this was a major event and would become one of the lasting international legacies of the Spanish Civil War. Speaking of international legacies of the war, there were many foreign countries and thousands of foreign individuals that would become involved with the fighting in Spain. For the nationalist cause, as previously mentioned, they would be supported by Germany and Italy, who both hoped that a victory by the nationalists would give them a strong supporter in the Western Mediterranean, which would cause problems for both the French and the British. They would support the war effort directly by sending both military equipment as well as men to fight with that equipment in Spain. Italy would be more involved with the fighting on the ground, while the main German manpower would be in the form of the Condor Legion, which would operate German Luftwaffe squadrons over Spain. Italian forces would be involved in several major Spanish offensives, which would include not just Italian infantry and artillery, but also armored units, to somewhat mixed results. The equipment that was provided to the nationalists was by far the most important contribution from Germany and Italy, helping to equip the Spanish units during the fighting. On the Republican side, they would receive support from the Soviet Union, which at this time was hoping to use the events in Spain to further the cause of international communism, as well as a way to check the spread of fascism. The Republican government would receive equipment and manpower from the Soviet Union during the Civil War, including aircraft and tanks that would be initially superior to anything that could be provided to the nationalists, although this qualitative advantage would decay over time. One of the problems with support from the Soviet Union was that it involved political complications, as they threw most of their weight behind the Spanish communist leaders, as you might expect from the Soviet Union, a communist state. These complications would lead to real problems as the war progressed. Another international contribution to the war came in the form of the International Brigades. These were military units made up of volunteers from around the world, although primarily from Europe, which would fight in the Republican armies during the war. While there would never be more than about 18,000 volunteers in Spain at any given time, and generally that number was far lower, the dedication shown by the international volunteers and the propaganda value of having them in Spain was seen as an important part of the Republican survival in the war. The exact military value of the brigades varied wildly, as many of the volunteers had no military training and were not in great military shape, But they were often used as shock troops, given dangerous tasks with high casualty rates, which meant that if they had courage, determination, and a rifle, they could still be useful. One of the reasons that the International Brigades were seen as important was that the other nations of Europe would have a strict non-intervention policy, with the British and French even committing naval strength to non-intervention patrols off the Spanish coasts, which were mostly useless. This official non-intervention policy was primarily put in place to avoid the events in Spain spilling out into a wider war in Europe, and then even maybe a worldwide war, at a time when the major powers of Europe, particularly Britain and France, were focused on a policy of appeasement with Hitler and Germany, who were seen as their most likely rivals in any conflict. During the early months of the war, the Republican military was quite different than what you might think of when you think of a modern military or a Second World War military. This was because it was first made up of a collection of militia units. But by October 1936, a shift was made to move these disparate units together into a popular army. From a military theory perspective, this was the correct move. The Nationalists were a more traditional military, and they seemed to be doing quite well, and so the answer appeared to be greater organization on the Republican side to make their forces look more like a traditional military force. However, some of the most fervent supporters of the anti-nationalist cause also did not support the kind of centralization required by the military changes. The most important of these groups would be the anarchists, which had the most support in Catalonia. The communists and anarchists would never agree on anything other than not liking the nationalists, and that was a very weak connection structure between the two groups. Tension between them would begin less than a year after the start of the war in the spring of 1937. The tensions would quickly escalate when there were accusations made by the largest anarchist union, the National Confederation of Labor, or the CNT. These accusations were simple, and they were that during the siege of Madrid, the communists were in control of the defenses of the city, but reports began to filter out that the prisons of Madrid were filling up, but not with nationalists, but instead socialists, anarchists, and Republicans. This was everything that the anarchists feared, that the communists were using the war as an excuse for their own brand of persecution. During the first week of May 1937, the tension between the anarchists and the communists would result in fighting in Barcelona, with both sides taking to the streets with their own worker militias. The central government would be powerless to stop this from happening, but they were themselves divided in multiple different ways. The anarchist workers within the city of Barcelona were not in a good position, though, with more and more communist assault guards groups being brought into the city, and eventually messages would be sent out from the CNT Central Committee to begin to take down the barricades. The violence of the May Days, as they were called in Barcelona, caused further crisis among the Republican government and would result in an erosion of support for the Republicans among the anarchist groups. This was deemed to be acceptable because many in the government had already come to the conclusion that the best path forward was with the communists. But as one anarchist would say after this time, quote, "Whether Negrin won with his communist cohorts or Franco won with his Italians and Germans, the results would be the same for us." I think that's an important quote because when you have multiple groups, different ideologically motivated groups, like what was happening in Barcelona at this time with the anarchists and the communists, and they are united only by their hatred of another group, if one of those groups loses faith in the one that they're fighting with, if they begin to see them in a similar light to the enemy, the sort of support for the alliance against the third party, in this case, the fascists, is just going to fall apart. There's just not going to be any support there. And that's really what happened in this case, both because of what the communists were doing, but also because the Republicans were losing the war, and that put a lot of strain on these working relationships that had been built up since the start of the crisis. Because the truth was, the anarchists and the communists, they would have come to an ideological conflict at some point during the war, but the events at the front simply accelerated things. Other than the defense of Madrid, the Republic would experience failure after failure in the war against the Nationalists. Not every battle was a total success for the Nationalists, but the course of the war was clear, as the Nationalists continuously whittled away at the Republican-controlled territory, taking control of places like Aragon and Cantabria and Asturias and the Basque Country, and then the list goes on and on and on. The Republican attacks or attempted attacks would continue, culminating in the Ebro offensive, which would primarily be launched not for military reasons, but instead propaganda reasons. The offensive would be launched in the summer of 1938, and by that point the international support for the Republican cause was lagging, with focus shifting instead to Germany and Czechoslovakia. In the summer of 1938, this is the summer of the Munich crisis. The Ebro offensive would be the last major failure of the Popular Army, and afterwards the eventual result of the Civil War was no longer in doubt. After the Nationalists captured Catalonia and Barcelona, the only remaining option was to begin negotiations, or at least the Republican military leaders believed that they were entering into negotiations. But Franco and the Nationalists simply demanded an unconditional surrender and then just kept attacking. On March 19, 1939, the formal surrender to Franco occurred, although it would take several more days for all Republican units to lay down their arms. The Nationalists were now in control of a broken country. Around 350,000 people had died during the war, both due to military actions and economic hardship. The national infrastructure was broken, the economy was destroyed, and although they did not know it at the time, there would be little international assistance in rebuilding Spain due to the Second World War. But Franco was in control, and he would maintain that control for the rest of his life. The toll that the 3 years of fighting took on Spain would cause Franco to keep Spain out of the Second World War, or at the very least it would make his price for entry too high for the Germans to pay. The impact of the fighting in Spain on the militaries of Europe is often overstated though. The Germans, Soviets, and Italians all gained some experience during the fighting in Spain, but each for their own reasons. That experience did not always translate into learning the right lessons. On the Soviet side, there was a tendency to discount experiences in Spain and to accuse the Soviet military commanders in Spain of betrayal. They would be caught up in the purges, just like the rest of the Red Army. For the Italians, their ability to learn and to react to events in Spain were limited by the ability of the Italian military to change course from an industrial perspective. And finally, for the Germans, their ability to learn lessons was limited by their belief that the war would be different when it was not primarily being participated in by Spanish troops. Even with these limitations, they would all gain experience, with the experience of the Luftwaffe in particular being important all the way up to the Battle of Britain and beyond. But the overall impact of the fighting in Spain and what it had on the course of war preparations around Europe in the late 1930s is often overstated. This is particularly true if you start reading German military theorists from this time, because they were basically just cherry-picking events in Spain to support the things that they already believed, and they discarded any events that did not agree with them as mistakes made by the Spanish, that the Germans would never make those mistakes. But while these foreign leaders or these foreign military theorists could cherry-pick and discard and look into events in Spain in their own ways, the Spanish would have to live with what had happened for generations. During the war, there would be harsh oppression by the Francoist regime of many former supporters of the Republic, and Franco would only officially end the war in Spain in 1948, with the goal not of ending the war because it had been over for 10 years by that point, but instead to improve relations with the Western democracies after the Second World War had ended. Due to the length of time that Franco would be in control in Spain, there were many questions that remained about the war and its aftermath even after his death in 1975, and there are still things that we do not know, and that we will probably never know, about what happened in Spain during the cataclysmic Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s that would reshape Spain for generations, and in some ways has reshaped it even into the modern day.